The Synchromystic presents Synchromystique. In this tumultuous election year, 2024, attention is purposefully being directed back to 1968. And this is emanating from establishment media channels, such as CBS, Fox News, and so on. In a few minutes, we'll think about why this might be the case. But first, what are the proposed connections? Most prominently, both 1968 and 2024 were and are presidential election years featuring, in the former case, Robert Francis Kennedy, and, in the latter case, Robert Francis Kennedy, Jr. According to some observers, the elder Kennedy's mere entry into the 1968 presidential race was enough to panic then-incumbent Lyndon Baines Johnson into abandoning his re-election bid. RFK Sr. was not the only reason LBJ threw in the towel. We'll consider another major one in a moment. On the contemporary scene, of course, RFK Jr. announced his candidacy April the 19th, 2023. Incumbent President Joseph Joe Biden made his own announcement on April 25th, 2023. Still, as things stand, Biden is out of the contest. A theme will develop more fully shortly. One wonders whether RFK Jr.'s presence helped to affect this outcome. Of course, RFK Jr. himself is now more or less sidelined as well. He suspended his campaign on August 23, 2024, and gave his qualified support to Republican candidate Donald John Trump. Trump is in the position, if he wins, of being the second president after so-called bourbon Democrat Stephen Grover Cleveland to have won 2 non-consecutive terms of office. In Cleveland's case, this was 1884 and 1892, respectively. Incidentally, Cleveland won the interim popular vote in 1888, but he lost the Electoral College to Republican Benjamin Harrison. We'll briefly revisit these electoral cycles in a little bit. Besides the Cleveland-Harrison rematch, 1892 also saw the creation of the Columbus Day national holiday, as well as the introduction of Francis Bellamy's Pledge of Allegiance, both of which were leveraged to promote the planned 400th commemoration of Christopher Columbus's arrival in the Americas at the Chicago World's Columbian Exposition in 1893. We mentioned this event, also called the Chicago World's Fair, in our recent September 11 video. The Columbian hoopla was bound up with debate over whether Catholic and Italian immigrants were sufficiently American. One could therefore argue for a similarity between 1892 and 2024, due to the recent dual emphases upon border integrity and illegal immigration. Admittedly, since Joe Biden is no longer in the running, 2024 doesn't have the same rematch flavor that Cleveland versus Harrison had in 1892. Moreover, you'll recall that 1968 was, for Republican Richard M. Nixon, more on whom in a moment, the second attempt to win the presidency. The first was in 1960, when he lost to RFK's brother, John Fitzgerald Kennedy. And this leads us to observe another striking dissimilarity. Whereas the senior RFK sought the Democratic nomination, his namesake, publicly chastising the Democratic Party for abandoning its New Deal and 1960s-era commitments, eventually sought to run as an independent. And that fact is our segue into another supposed 1968 association. Given the not unjustified criticism of the U.S. as a two-party system, remarkably, 1968 was one of those odd contests where a so-called third-party candidate was given national attention. That last qualification is important, of course, since neither criticism of nor the attempt to break the political duopoly is anything especially new. Just ask Ralph Nader or Henry Ross Perot. In fact, dissenting groups go back at least to the Anti-Masonic Party, which was formed in 1828 after the murder of Captain William Morgan. We mentioned this in September 11 and got further into the details in Presidents and Secret Societies. In 1968, the outsider happened to be once and future Alabama Governor George Corley Wallace Jr. Just prior to this, Wallace served as first gentleman to his wife, Lurleen Burns Wallace, who was elected governor in 1966, basically serving as her husband's surrogate to circumvent term limits. You can look it up if you're interested. Mr. Wallace launched his presidential bid with U.S. Air Force General Curtis Emerson LeMay for vice president. The latter reportedly was the selection of late Texas oil billionaire Nelson Bunker Hunt. LeMay, under General Henry Harley Hap Arnold, and with the support of General Lawrence Norstad, had been a main instigator of the policy of firebombing Japanese cities during World War II. LeMay is also said to have been one of the real-life inspirations for film director Stanley Kubrick's psychopathic General Jack D. Ripper in his 1964 dark comedy classic, Dr. Strangelove. By the way, General LeMay and President John F. Kennedy reportedly despised one another. LeMay, along with General Lyman Louis Lemnitzer, advocated an American-initiated nuclear attack on the Soviet Union, as well as false flag terrorism directed against U.S. citizens, and orchestrated to create a pretext for invading Cuba. You can see Operation Northwoods. Incidentally, LeMay's whereabouts during the JFK assassination, which event we got into elsewhere, were unknown until around 2009. At that point, an audio tape originally created aboard Air Force One on November 22, 1963, passed out of the estate of JFK aide General Chester Victor Clifton Jr., and into the public record. The recording suggests that LeMay was airborne in a Lockheed Martin C-140 while the assassination of the president was unfolding. During the 1960s, the military used C-140s for communications and operational support. What operational support LeMay might have provided that fateful November day is anyone's guess. Not only this, but according to Paul Kelly O'Connor, who assisted Dr. James J. Humes with JFK's autopsy at the Bethesda Naval Hospital in Bethesda, Maryland, Curtis LeMay ended up sitting in the autopsy observation gallery with a big cigar in his hand. Admittedly, this is difficult to verify, not least because Dr. Humes, by his own admission, destroyed by burning his notes related to the Naval Medical School autopsy report, and officially transmitted all other papers related to this report to quote-unquote, a higher authority. If the story is true, then General LeMay knew more about Kennedy's autopsy than the Warren Commission, since the Warren Commission never even saw photographs of the autopsy. Then again, autopsies evidently have ceremonial significance in the ancient mysteries and have been preserved by the Freemasonic rite of entrusting. But where were we? Oh yes, 1968. The year was also notable because it marked the downfall of the once proud Texan, Lyndon Baines Johnson. After all, besides the RFK factor, the reason was Vietnam. As late as 1967 and early 1968, LBJ had still been marshalling spokesmen, such as General William Childs Westmoreland, then head of the United States' so-called Military Assistance Command in Vietnam, MACV, to make the case to the American people that there was a light at the end of the tunnel for the war. American victory was supposedly near at hand. The Tet Offensive put paid to that idea. Remember, LBJ was the guy who in 1964 won one of the greatest landslide victories in American history against Republican Barry Goldwater. But in the words of Professor John Mearsheimer, by mid-1968, LBJ was a broken man who left office in disgrace. Well, not to rub salt on Joe Biden's wounds, but for right-leaning political observers anyway, the latter description, a broken man leaving office in disgrace, is tempting to apply to the 46th U.S. president as well, especially after his horror show debate performance June 27, 2024. Of course, since that first presidential debate was scheduled before his party's convention, you could make the case that it was prearranged by a faction of Democratic insiders to intentionally derail Biden's campaign. A coup d'etat of sorts. See Michael Hoffman for that argument. Still, it's true that once LBJ removed his name from the hat, Dems turned to the vice president, as indeed they're doing again this year. Hubert Humphrey in 1968, Kamala Harris in 2024. In both cases, the pivot was cemented in Chicago, Illinois, during the Democratic National Convention. As a point of order, however, the 1996 Democratic Convention was also held in Chicago, but that year evidently doesn't work so well for those drawing this analogy, so we'll ignore it. In the words of a Wikipedia summary statement, the 1968 Chicago Democratic Convention was among the most tense and confrontational political conventions ever in American history, marked by fierce debate and protest over the Vietnam peace talks. These former protests were further compared to those in 2024, premised upon opposition to the Israeli genocide of Palestinians in Gaza. However, as the New York Times observed, pro-Palestinian protesters gathered, but they did not steal the show. The authors then added, with more than a hint of triumphalism, it wasn't 1968. It wasn't even close. An unspoken difference here is that, in 1968, the American business community had turned against the Vietnam War, thus making public protests permissible. Whereas in 2024, the leadership of both major parties almost compete to see who can be more stridently pro-Israel. Back in '68, there was also controversy at the Democratic Convention over the heavy-handed police tactics of the convention's host, Mayor Richard J. Daley of Chicago. Interestingly, as RFK Jr. was making the rounds on the YouTube interview circuit, he addressed long-standing charges that his uncle, JFK, had been elected in 1960, partly through the alleged mob connections of his dad, Joseph P. Kennedy, as well as the ballot-rigging shenanigans of the above-named mayor, who has often been called the last of the political bosses. We got into some of the historical context for this in 10 Milestones in Election Fraud. It's also perhaps worth remembering that Humphrey's running mate, then Senator from Maine Edmund Muskie, would later be targeted by the Dirty Tricks Department of Republican President Richard Milhous Nixon's campaign to re-elect the president in 1972. Note that numerous authors have argued for the existence of links in the relevant period between Richard Nixon and George Bush, which latter was, even at the time, almost certainly a CIA agent. This conclusion is partially by inference from a 1963 post-JFK assassination memo from no less a personage than Federal Bureau of Investigation Director J. Edgar Hoover, as we've explained in our other materials. In any event, Muskie evidently made peace with the George H.W. Bush faction of the Central Intelligence Agency, however. You'll recall that in 1987, Muskie, along with Brent Scowcroft and John Tower, covered up Bush's apparently deep involvement in the Iran-Contra affair. Without Muskie's help, America might never have had the 11th CIA director as its 41st president. So, thanks, Ed. Nixon's campaign to re-elect, derisively abbreviated CREEP, culminated with the June 1972 break-in of Democratic headquarters inside the Watergate Hotel complex. Though it's admittedly at least a slight digression from the main topic, we can't help mentioning that the Watergate revelations themselves thicken the overall plot for anyone attempting to understand how the world really works. We touched on Watergate in 10 Occultist Spies. Here, consider the publication at the epicenter of the Watergate disclosures, Katharine Graham's Washington Post. Firstly, we can't forget that Kay Graham was the daughter of mega financier Eugene Isaac Meyer. Meyer made his pile as the head of the brokerage of Eugene Meyer & Co., which specialized in railroad, copper, oil, and automobile financing. During World War I, Meyer ran Woodrow Wilson's War Finance Corporation, where he interfaced with people like Bernard Baruch on the War Industries Board, as well as with William Proctor Gould Harding and Paul Moritz Warburg on Wilson's Federal Reserve. Among other members of the money elite, such as associates of J.P. Morgan, the War Industries Board was populated with agents of railroad tycoon Edward Henry E. H. Harriman. This included Union Pacific President Robert S. Lovett and Samuel Prescott Bush. Yes, that Bush family. In 1933, Eugene Meyer bought the Washington Post after the McLean family, which had owned it since 1905, brought it to bankruptcy. The story goes that Meyer restored the Post to financial viability and was chairman of the board until his death in 1959. By 1946, publishing duties had, however, evidently passed to Meyer's son-in-law, Philip Graham. According to the System Sanitized story, control of the WAPO transferred to K. Graham upon Phil Graham's death. But two factors militate against this thesis. The first and most obvious is K's already discussed powerhouse family connection. The second is Phil's odd death. You see, he supposedly committed suicide by shotgun blast August 3rd, 1963. Together, these facts raise the possibility that hubby Graham had just been a flunky, while Catherine the Great had really taken over directly from bankster superdaddy Eugene Meyer. In any case, Kay took the post public in 1971, just as the Pentagon Papers were coming to light. The Pentagon Papers were billed as a damning Vietnam War expose. Maybe they were, but once again, the approved story has more than a few odd and suggestive features. For example, Daniel Ellsberg, the military analyst who leaked the documents to the New York Times and the Washington Post, was employed by the RAND Corporation. Among other things, RAND is a deep state think tank that has produced many seeds of technology that continue to be developed into modern and mucho profitable marvels such as artificial intelligence, or AI, digital computing and the internet, game and decision theories, the space program, government budgeting and cost analysis, telecommunications equipment and networks, and on and on. Oh, by the way, RAND was the brainchild of U.S. Air Force General Henry H. Hap Arnold, working in conjunction with Generals Loris Norstad and Curtis LeMay. Additionally, Ellsberg worked for Defense Secretary Robert McNamara, alongside later Council on Foreign Relations insiders Leslie Les Gelb, Morton H. Halperin, Richard Holbrooke, and Paul C. Warnke. It's somewhat odd that Ellsberg's perspectives were promoted as damaging to the establishment, for example by Massachusetts Institute of Technology activist Professor Noam Chomsky, even as those same revelations enjoyed wide play in the major media, a fact which should give pause to any thoughtful observer. In other words, why would the establishment promote information damaging to itself? And then there's the case of attorney Murray Irwin Gurfein. During World War II, Gurfein was an operative in William Wild Bill Donovan's Office of Strategic Services, the forerunner of the U.S. Central Intelligence Agency, CIA. After the war, Gurfein worked with Supreme Court Justice Robert H. Jackson prosecuting Nazis at the Nuremberg trials. For a bit more, see 10 Nazi Occultists Part 2. Afterward, Gurfein's legal ambitions were boosted by several prominent Republicans, including Tricky Dick Nixon himself and Leslie Lynch King, better known as 38th President Gerald R. Ford. Ford was the only U.S. chief executive so far, by the way, to have achieved that position wholly apart from any election. You'll recall that Nixon appointed Ford to replace then Vice President Spiro Agnew when the latter resigned between October the 9th and October the 10th, 1973, and then Ford ascended to the presidency when Nixon himself resigned August the 8th, 1974. For more, see Secret Societies. Okay, back to Gurfein. In the words of a Wikipedia article, during his first week as a United States District Judge, Gurfein was assigned the Pentagon Papers case and gained national prominence when he refused the government's motion to enjoin publication of the documents. Here, enjoin means issue an injunction against. Got that? Ex-OSS Judge Gurfein just happened to get this important case. You know, the one with intelligence agencies swirling all around it right out of the gate. It's almost like he was appointed for that purpose. But nah. In any case, the Washington Post's K. Graham was a member of the Georgetown Set, a coterie of affluent and connected civilians who, according to Professor Greg Herkin, guided the country from the Marshall Plan through McCarthyism, Watergate, and Vietnam. Guided behind the scenes, of course. The elite group also welcomed ex-Office of Naval Intel agent and Washington Post managing editor Benjamin Ben Bradley. And it's said to have included system-anointed wise men Dean Acheson, Charles Chip Bolin, W. Averell Harriman, and later George Kennan. It also included seminal CIA players like Richard Mervyn Bissell Jr. and Desmond Fitzgerald. The latter dropped dead of a heart attack at age 57 on July 23, 1967, as well as Cord Meyer, whose ex-wife was romantically involved with JFK, and Frank Wisner, a CIA founder who, like Phil Graham, allegedly offed himself via shotgun. For Wisner, October the 29th, 1965. Recall that K. Graham's dad, Eugene Meyer, had been at different times the head of the Federal Reserve and the World Bank. It's a small world after all, since John J. McCloy, yet another Georgetown-connected policy planner and another member of the Warren Commission, succeeded Meyer as World Bank president. Additionally, Pentagon Papers organizer Robert McNamara went from being defense secretary to president of the World Bank in 1968. And what about the reporters who broke the Watergate story? One of them, Carl Bernstein, admits both his parents, Albert and Sylvia, had been card-carrying communists, and the other, Robert Bob Woodward, was, like his big boss man Bradley, formerly of Naval Intelligence. You may be forgiven for thinking 1968 was a sort of gateway into various aspects of this intel spookery. Being somewhat synchromystically inclined, we wonder whether these things were obliquely telegraphed to our collective unconscious, our dreaming minds, or our subconscious, if you go in for that sort of thing. Telegraphed how, you ask? Fair question. Well, let's work backward from 9/11. That is, the attacks of September 11th, 2001. Recall first that Michael Hoffman somewhere pointed out that these numerals, 9, 1, and 1, just happened to come pre-associated, as it were, in our noggins with the idea of emergency. After all, in most U.S. locales, we dial 911 when we need ambulance, fire, police, or other first responder services. Did the Pilgrims set up this system after they docked the Mayflower? Nah, the whole thing got going in, wait for it, 1968. The first 911 call was made to some fanfare by Alabama politician Ernest Rankin Fite, who had evidently been tight with George Wallace. In an earlier video, we previously mentioned the symbolic importance of Roman Polanski's 1968 film, Rosemary's Baby. The movie has to do with the inauguration of a satanic age, and it just happened to herald the arrival, the following year, of what the Vatican's Paul VI called his Novus Ordo Missae, or New Order of the Mass. See our video January 6 for context and details. Then there are the serial killers, imprinted on the public starting in earnest in the 1960s, when the phrase was coined. Cases such as those of Charles Manson, Richard Speck, and the Zodiac were highly publicized. Albert Fish, Ed Gein, and Earl Leonard Nelson notwithstanding, and despite the media's relentless and imaginative fixation on supposed precursory crimes going back to prehistory, we would argue that, in an important sense, serial killers are a contemporary invention. Indeed, to our minds, a most compelling antecedent is the sensational 1888 killer known as Jack the Ripper. Some of the most intriguing aspects of the case are its many unmistakable connections to the British Crown, English Freemasonry, and, by extension, British intelligence. So, when Albert DeSalvo confessed to being the one and only Boston Strangler, sometime after his arrest for rape, October 27, 1964, we shouldn't be shocked that two of the major players were CIA-connected hypnotist William Joseph Bryan and CIA-connected lawyer F. Lee Bailey. The pattern recurs, as Michael Hoffman pointed out in his 1992 book, Secret Societies and Psychological Warfare. Among the subjects he takes up is the suspicious Son of Sam case from the 1970s, murders which, in all probability, were the work of a cult called The Process. Behind that episode lurks Jewish-Norwegian forensic psychiatrist David Abrahamson, who was consulted as an expert. Abrahamson was further linked to the London-based, and some say MI6-connected, Tavistock Clinic. Abrahamson garnered attention for psychological profiles of various people such as Lee Harvey Oswald and Richard Nixon. And just to round things out, we'll note Abrahamson championed the hypothesis that Prince Albert Victor had been Jack the Ripper. An updated edition of Secret Societies was published in 2001. The cover art displayed a monolith that had been then recently and mysteriously erected in Seattle, Washington. Hoffman arranged his front matter imagery in a Warholian, Campbell's soup cans-esque way. This stylistic choice seems eminently fitting for our topic, not least because on June the 3rd, 1968, an unhinged, self-proclaimed radical feminist named Valerie Jean Solanas went to Andy Warhol's studio, called The Factory, and attempted, but failed, to blow Warhol away. In a screed titled The Scum Manifesto, Solanas hyperventilated that men ruined the world, and she recommended that women, well, get rid of them all via her Society for Cutting Up Men. Before we leave Warhol, we'll observe that on April 24th, 1981, none other than Donald Trump visited Warhol's factory. The occasion was a business meeting, during which the discussion was a possible commission for Warhol to decorate Trump Tower with his artwork. The two never came to terms, despite Warhol creating more than half a dozen exemplars, though for his part, Trump has several times expressed affinity for one of Warhol's aphorisms. Trump once wrote, "There's a certain amount of bravado in what I do these days, and part of that bravado is to make it look easy." I've always liked Andy Warhol's statement that making money is art, and working is art, and good business is the best art. Note as well, en passant, that the previously named presidential also-ran, George Wallace, was rendered a paraplegic when Arthur Herman Bremer tried to assassinate him at the Laurel Shopping Center in Laurel, Maryland. Though this occurred May 15, 1972, and so not 1968. But back to monoliths. Hoffman's aforementioned reference was ultimately to Stanley Kubrick's masterful but ambiguous 2001 A Space Odyssey, first released to theaters April 3rd, 1968. A pivotal scene shows the discovery of a 2-million-year-old monolith on the moon, which is all the more intriguing given that, on Christmas Eve 1968, NASA astronauts Frank Borman, Jim Lovell, and Bill Anders were the first humans to orbit the moon. The monolith structures again sprang up like winter wheat starting around November 2020. On December 11, 2020, CNN reported that after 51 years, the Zodiac Killer's cipher had been solved by amateur codebreakers, drawing attention once again back to 1968-1969. Construction and placement of the strange monolith artifacts continue to pace throughout the pandemic years, as we reviewed in our video January 6th. The symbolic point of these ornaments may have been to signal various unspecified coming epochal changes analogous to the evolutionary jumps monoliths betokened in Kubrick's film. If you have any doubts about whether Kubrick, a mere Hollywood auteur, could possibly have been politically sophisticated enough to be in the know on a lot of the crypto-politics of the relevant era, I'd recommend that you take a look at Rob Ager's video, Behind the Propaganda. Ager makes a compelling case that Kubrick, who was by that time based in the United Kingdom, arguably outfoxed 2001's corporate sponsors. Ager has it that Kubrick misled investors to believe that he was delivering pro-technology, space race-boosting, military-industrial complex-friendly propaganda, only to take the money and run with his own artistic, anti-technology vision. Relatedly, and partially on account of facts like this, some have suggested that, rather than dying of a heart attack in 1999, as usually reported, Kubrick himself had in fact been murdered by a Masonic satanic poisoning, in line with the subject of his final film, Eyes Wide Shut. We'll have to explore that topic another time. In any event, and lo and behold, there have been fresh monolith sightings in 2024. Is this predictive programming? If so, what is it telling us? It's hard to know, but an obvious and ominous short-term possibility is we're in store for a 1968-style Year of the Assassination Redux. We'll just rehearse the biggies. Of course, there's the killing of Michael King Jr., better known as Martin Luther King Jr., on April 4th at the Lorraine Motel in Memphis, Tennessee, by sniper rifle, evidently. The official story has it that petty criminal James Earl Ray done it, but by now even Wikipedia sows seeds of doubt. As of this writing, if you inspect its article, Assassination of Martin Luther King Jr., under the subhead Perpetrators, you'll see the word disputed. Attention is then partially directed to one Lloyd Jowers, whose confession was broadcast in 1993 by ABC News' Primetime Live. This is either astounding or an intriguing example of what intelligence operatives call a limited hangout, or both, not least because ABC was still hard selling the Lee Harvey Oswald line in the JFK assassination fully 10 years after the Jowers interview and 40 years after the event. In any case, 63 days after MLK's slaying, on June 5th, Robert Francis Kennedy, or RFK, was murdered at the Ambassador Hotel in Los Angeles, California. Here, blame was immediately assigned to a Palestinian-born Jordanian bearing the tautonym Sirhan Sirhan. By the way, Sirhan has long denied having shot RFK, at least consciously. You'll remember investigators William Turner and John Christian seriously explored the possibility that Sirhan was an MK-Ultra CIA mind control experiment, and that his hypno-programmer may have been Los Angeles-based psychologist William Joseph Bryan. We hope you'll recall that name from our discussion of the Boston Strangler, for which Bryan, who was, by the way, a grandson of famed 19th century populist orator William Jennings Bryan, was also employed as a hypnotist. The remarkable fact is 2024 has already brought renewed attention to this assassination, which was, of course, ascribed to a Palestinian. To Fortean cryptozoologist Lauren Coleman, Sirhan's alleged speculated motive may have been to commemorate the first anniversary of the first day of the Six-Day War between Israel and its Arab neighbors, on June 5, 1967. For those who are not satisfied with this conjecture, including, according to his public statements, RFK Jr., one Thane Eugene Caesar is frequently nominated as a more likely candidate than Sirhan, and not just because the word Thane also shows up in the Macbeth symbol complex as part of the JFK assassination killing of the king ritual. Caesar's resume is replete with references to military-industrial complex heavy hitters like the Hughes Aircraft Corporation. In 1968, Caesar found work at Lockheed Martin, but just prior to RFK's assassination, he started moonlighting as a security guard for the Ambassador Hotel. Go fig. Caesar acquaintance Jim Yoder claimed that Caesar appeared to have no specific job at Lockheed, but only floating assignments, and that Caesar often worked in off-limits areas, to which only special personnel had access. According to Yoder, these areas were under CIA control. Now, that might strike a crass propagandist like Michael Shermer as implausible. Then again, in the wilderness of mirrors, skeptic, like a lot of abused words, literally means the opposite of what you'll find in the dictionary. If Michael Shermer has ever been anything other than an apologist for shop-worn materialism and other system-approved dogmas, we're certainly unaware of it. The more independent-minded David Talbot explains, in his 2015 book The Devil's Chessboard, the CIA had an elite reputation, but within the organization was a distinct class system. Ivy League types on the top, ex-FBI hard guys and former cops in the middle ranks of enforcement, and the even more ruthless and disposable hired guns at the bottom. Got that? Disposable hired guns. One need not suppose, therefore, that Thane Eugene Caesar was considered among America's best and brightest. I'd wager that his handlers, if indeed that's the way things were, probably hoped Caesar would join RFK in the morgue that night. The point, as Fox News and other outlets were quick to make, is that this year's assassination attempt on Donald Trump, by sniper's rifle no less, is reminiscent of these earlier crimes. If there are caveats, one of them might be that Trump's survival is perhaps more reminiscent of Wallace or Warhol than MLK or RFK, by divine intervention, design, or chance, as you please. Now, if the shooter had been named Andy, maybe that'd be different. But another caveat is that 1968 was not, unfortunately, America's only brush with major assassinations. One need only think of John Fitzgerald Kennedy to satisfy oneself on that point. In fact, the really miserable thing is not that it's hard to think of counterexamples, it's that it's so bleedin' easy. Speaking of 1963, black activist Medgar Evers was killed June 12th. Malcolm Little, better known as Malcolm X, met a similarly violent end February 19, 1965. Apparently, on the opposite end of the political spectrum, white activist George Lincoln Rockwell was likewise assassinated August 25, 1967. I say apparently on the opposite end because it's a little considered fact that the man-born Elijah Robert Poole, who is best remembered as the Nation of Islam leader Elijah Muhammad, once invited Rockwell to address his black Muslims because of their concord on the issue of racial separation. Black Panthers members Mark Clark and Fred Hampton were killed December 4th, 1969, etc., etc. And if we extend our horizons beyond the USA, even restricting ourselves to the 1960s, then we come across names such as Patrice Lumumba, Eduardo Mondlane, No Ding Diem, and Rafael Trujillo, all of whom were assassinated, and all of whose assassinations, a variety of researchers have plausibly argued, bear the impress of U.S. intelligence. Were we to further look beyond the 1960s, we're not going to, but if we did, then, as our Italian-American friends might say, forget about it. Although, as a teaser for an upcoming video, remember the first U.S. Secretary of Defense, James Vincent Forrestal. Google tells us 1968 in America is often considered to be one of the most turbulent years of the 20th century, with enough aftershock to shape America for decades. Fox News concurs. 1968 was the year society changed and political order disintegrated. That's really the punchline. New World Order talk is, of course, nothing new, but it appears that we the people are being put on notice. Things are about to change. Yet again, if a Kennedy is now enthusiastically backing a Republican, something's going down, right? From our vantage point in flyover country, are we consigned to chalk these up to vagaries? Maybe, and maybe not, as W.C. Fields used to say. The 1968 riffs suggest a few details as to how and what may change. Here's a hint or two. Let's talk about RFK Jr. A lifelong Democrat, he's been openly expressing his dissatisfaction with that party. And let's face it, the name Kennedy is practically a byword for Democratic politics. Does this suggest that some broader political or voter realignment is in motion? Possibly. To catch the drift of this, think about the so-called party system model of U.S. history. First articulated by political scientists Walter Dean Burnham and William Nisbet Chambers, it was extended by theorists such as Paul Kleppner, Richard McCormick, and others. The gist is that politics has evolved over time. According to Burnham, the stages of this evolution can be both identified and numbered, although subsequent thinkers differ in their suggested counts of how many stages the country has allegedly gone through. 5, 6, and 7 seem to be prime candidates, but the question is open. Moreover, the hypothesized stages may be characterized as representing periods of predictability and stability in national politics. These stable periods are interrupted at intervals by what Burnham called critical elections. These elections, so the thinking goes, embody or portend realignments. That is, sweeping changes in political commitments, ideologies, and priorities, as well as in the identities of spokespersons and supporters. A few examples, although not uncontroversial, will hopefully clarify things. Without getting into detail, one such alignment arguably occurred during the time of Andrew Jackson. Between 1824 and 1832, the Democratic-Republican Party of Thomas Jefferson split into Jacksonian and anti-Jacksonian factions over issues such as national banking. For more on this time period, including special attention paid to the charges of a corrupt bargain in 1824, see 10 Milestones in Election Fraud. By the way, in that same video, you'll hear about a second realigning period that corresponded to the end of the Civil War and the beginning of Reconstruction. At that time, Southern pro-slavery Democrats were defeated and criminalized. The Democratic Party's platform morphed into one that was hard to distinguish from the era's abolitionist republicanism, which had just given the vote to 4 million non-citizen slaves. A third, off-sided realignment took place in the 1890s. This was the so-called Gilded Age, approximately 1870s to 1890s, during which Grover Cleveland and Benjamin Harrison passed the presidency back and forth as previously noted. The two parties jockeyed for position as major patrons and beneficiaries of banking and oil interests, railroads, steel companies, and on and on. The ensuing and palpable governmental preference for finance and industry brought forth populists such as the fiery orator William Jennings Bryan and ushered in the Progressive Era. During this period, Republicans held a range of views on the role of government in regulating big business, which was bigger than ever with the likes of Andrew Carnegie, J.P. Morgan, William Randolph Hearst, and the Rockefeller family. William Howard Taft publicly took the position that the government shouldn't meddle with business, whereas Theodore Teddy Roosevelt ostensibly believed in having a big government capable of regulating big business. The fight between Roosevelt and Taft led to the former's creation of the Bull Moose Party, and his temporary defection from the Republicans. It also led to Democrat Woodrow Wilson's 2 terms, starting in 1912. After World War I, Wilson was incapacitated, possibly due to a stroke. This resulted in the irregular and mysterious involvement of his second wife, Edith, whom some call the first female president. The cover-up of Wilson's true condition was spearheaded by naval physician Carrie T. Grayson, working with Naval Intelligence Officer A.D. Irving, a grandnephew of Washington Irving. This ultimately led, in 1967, to the ratification of the 25th Constitutional Amendment, which clarified vice presidential succession procedures. Said amendment was operative during the Nixon-Ford episode and has been much discussed in light of Joe Biden's apparent cognitive impairments. But here's the salient point. During the time of Taft and Teddy Roosevelt, the small government versus big government debate, which we ordinarily think of as a partisan issue, had evidently not yet acquired that status. It wasn't yet emblematic of Republican-Democrat disagreements. Finally, there was the portentous first election of 4 of Democratic President Franklin Delano Roosevelt in 1932. FDR's New Deal liberalism was embraced by frontmen from both parties until the dual rise of trilateral Democrats and neoconservative Republicans between 1968 and 1973. The result of these trends was obvious by the time of William Jefferson Blythe III, better known as Bill Clinton, who, as a Democrat, declared, "The era of big government is over." Accordingly, former Federal Reserve Chairman Alan Greenspan once joked, "I think Bill Clinton was the best Republican president we've had in a while." Previously mentioned reporter Bob Woodward further quoted Clinton himself as stating, during a White House meeting, "We're Eisenhower Republicans here, and we are fighting the Reagan Republicans." Think of this as political alchemy, where alchemy, of course, has to do with occult transformation. Incidentally, the former naval man Woodward continues to pop up, as attested in a recent piece from the British-based newspaper Independent. Woodward is giving voice to Donald Trump's former chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, U.S. Army General Mark Milley, who now complains that the current Republican presidential nominee is fascist to the core. Another instance of political alchemy pertains to the man that journalist Wayne Madsen, allegedly previously of the U.S. Navy and it seems also the National Security Agency, or NSA, alleged had been installed as president by the CIA. We're talking, of course, about 44th President Barack Hussein Obama. Also a Clinton-style Democrat, Obama similarly told one interviewer that his policies were those of a 1980s-style moderate Republican. Amplifying this theme, the one-time liberal politician and later convicted felon Jesse Jackson Jr., son of activist Jesse Louis Burns, better known as Jesse Jackson, once opined that most Southern Democratic elected officials would be Republicans above the Mason-Dixon line. Admittedly, many new Democrats have embraced what some pundits call cultural Marxism on sociocultural issues such as abortion, feminism, gay rights, and so on. At the same time, as Ron Paul once pointed out, many prominent neoconservatives like James Burnham, Louis Samuel Foyer, and Irving William Kristol themselves started off as radical leftists. For example, Marxists, Trotskyites, etc. We'll have to look more into these phenomena. Let's bear down on economics. Recall first that 1968 marked a major turning point on that front. On March 18, 1968, the U.S. Congress passed Public Law 90-269. Commentators have described it as having eliminated gold reserve requirements for Federal Reserve notes. That same year, Richard Nixon, by the way, arguably one of the last of the New Deal presidents, oversaw the beginning of the dismantling of the post-World War II monetary framework. Lyndon LaRouche and Webster Griffin Tarpley have suggested that, according to the upper echelons of financiers and news media, Nixon was viewed as having bungled the transition to a new system. Thus, according to LaRouche and Tarpley, the Watergate break-in and cover-up was a convenient means of overthrowing Nixon. Noam Chomsky similarly has cautioned that the case of Woodward and Bernstein helping to topple a president is actually an example of the subordination of the media to power. This is because, as Chomsky puts it, the Democratic Party represents essentially half of the corporate system which runs the country. And that is real power. You don't attack real power, as Nixon did when his staff organized the Watergate burglary, because people in power can defend themselves, and this is amply attested by Nixon's downfall. On this wavelength, it's also worth pondering the fact that the previously mentioned would-be assassin Arthur Bremer intimated that he would have preferred and set out to try to kill Richard Nixon, but he settled for shooting Wallace instead. In any case, the old system, designed at Bretton Woods, New Hampshire, by figures like British economist John Maynard Keynes and U.S. Treasury Department official and later accused spy Harry Dexter White, had instituted tight restrictions on the flow of capital. This was because capital controls, that is, regulation of financial capital, allows governments to carry out monetary and tax policies and to sustain employment and social programs without fear of capital flight. Capital flight is when a business takes its money out of a company, country, community, whatever, if the operative politics isn't to that company's liking. It's the corporate equivalent of voting with your wallet. Nixon inaugurated an unprecedented period of the liberalization of capital, accentuated by his closure of the gold window on August 15, 1971, ending the Bretton Woods era of fixed exchange rates. The gold window was a system that allowed foreign governments to exchange dollars for gold at the U.S. Treasury. The upshot, according to historians at the online Federal Reserve History Project, was that foreign governments could no longer exchange their dollars for gold. In effect, the international monetary system turned into a fiat one. This action kickstarted the so-called financialization of the U.S. economy, by which, for example, the banking sector, with an ever-increasing supply of fiat cash, would set about buying up, or privatizing, all the squares on the monopoly board. This interval, via processes of deregulation, legalized a bewildering array of manipulations, like stock buybacks, and introduced a mystifying assortment of investment instruments, such as derivatives and mortgage-backed securities. Do these policies still rule the roost? Well, ex-Wall Street trader Max Keiser has been saying for a while that we're entering into a new era of what he calls de-dollarization and de-globalization. In other words, in Kaiser's opinion, economics is shifting. But don't take Max Keiser's word for it. After all, hasn't Klaus Schwab of the Trilateral Commission competing World Economic Forum advertised something similar? His slogan is, by 2030 you'll own nothing and be happy. Also consider the apparently imminent rollout of various central bank digital currencies, or CBDCs, and, well, I think you get the picture. Add to all this the foreign policy situation. There's a perceptible shift in the proverbial world order. Start again with the 1960s. Soviet Premier Nikita Khrushchev, granted his rule ended in '64, tried to go tit for tat with the U.S. in an arms race. In hindsight, that decision seems to have been a crucial factor in the eventual collapse of the USSR. Circa 1989 to 1990. But the fall of the Soviet Union gives crucial context to George Bush I's New World Order quips, twice spoken to the U.S. Congress in January and then March of 1991. Bush outlined a new world order that had replaced the bipolar politics of the Cold War era. As international relations theorist John Mearsheimer explains, when the Soviet Union was intact, the world had two, albeit unevenly matched, superpowers. But when the USSR went kaput, the world entered the unipolar moment. The US became Godzilla and could do whatever it wanted. And what it wanted was to reshape the global order in its image, or at least in accord with its economic and geopolitical interests. For the details, see Mearsheimer. Our takeaway is that the world is now moving into multipolarity. On the one hand, you've got the rise of China, and on the other, you've got Vladimir Putin's Russia. Therefore, from a global political standpoint, the U.S. in 2024 is on the verge of a different stage of international relations. As it happens, we have a case study, one that fits into the previously cited Sirhan symbol pattern. That is, the U.S. association with Israel. First, we need context. when the newly minted State of Israel, in cahoots with Britain and France, tried to take the Suez Canal from Egypt in 1956, after Gamal Nasser nationalized it, then-President Dwight D. Eisenhower made the Israelis give it back, quite different from the post-JFK special U.S.-Israel relationship. By the time you get to LBJ, things change for Israel. In a big way. Just think about the previously named Six-Day War, when in 1967 Israel took over all of what are called the occupied territories, the Golan Heights from Syria, the West Bank from Jordan, and Gaza and the Sinai Peninsula from Egypt. With the exception of Sinai, a story that needn't concern us, Israel still controls these areas in violation of international law 57 years later. LBJ did nothing to stand up to Israel, despite the fact that, in the course of its far-flung attack, Israel strafed and torpedoed the USS Liberty, leaving 34 Americans dead and 171 wounded. The received view, courtesy of what John Mearsheimer and Stephen Wolt call the Israel lobby, is that it was just a boo-boo, but Israeli aircraft circled the Liberty 3 times before committing to that attack. It's especially telling that survivors of the attack, including U.S. naval officers and a number of officials, including then CIA Director Richard Helms, and then Secretary of State Dean Rusk, as well as Pentagon Papers researcher Paul C. Warnke, mentioned earlier, believed the attack was deliberate. The roster of skeptics is so lengthy and distinguished that we'll have to content ourselves with a single example. Admiral Thomas Hinman Moorer, U.S. Chief Naval Officer at the time, emphatically stated, "I have to conclude that it was Israel's intent to sink the Liberty and leave as few survivors as possible. Israel knew perfectly well that the ship was American." If that shocks you, you might do well to reflect on the words of longtime CIA analyst Ray McGovern. He has argued that the U.S. and Israel are only allies in a sense that's as special, meaning here irregular, as the two countries' supposed relationship. According to McGovern, the U.S. and Israel have never entered into a true mutual defense treaty. Maybe this is why even Newsweek had to report, first in 2014, that according to documents leaked by alleged whistleblower Edward Snowden, the National Security Agency singled out Israel as a top espionage threat against the U.S. government. However, a proviso comes to us by way of Naomi Wolf, who in 2013 registered her worry that Edward Snowden and his sexy girlfriend might be government plants. Don't forget, fully in line with our running Assassinations subthread, in 2003, United Press International journalist Richard Sale reported Israel will stage targeted killings in the United States and other friendly countries, according to former Israeli intelligence officials. Are the winds of change blowing in 2024? In the wake, or should I say in the midst, of Israel's ongoing atrocities in Gaza, Time magazine now remarkably dares to wonder aloud whether it's time to rethink the U.S.-Israeli special relationship. On top of this, a former head of Israel's domestic intelligence service, Shin Bet, recently told Israeli Army Radio that the country is on the brink of civil war, not to mention pulling the U.S. into conflicts on multiple fronts. Speaking of internal rifts, finally, we'll add that one of the little noticed, but ultimately profound developments triggered by the current Gaza war is that it shows a fundamental new split in the once ironclad unity of the Jewish community. One faction represents old guard Theodor Herzlian Zionism, which aims to fulfill Talmudic commands to return to Israel and build a third temple, or, in Freemasonic ideology, to rebuild the Temple of Solomon. This group has specimens on both sides of the political aisle, including, for the GOP, hedge fund honcho Paul Elliott Singer, Home Depot founder Bernard Marcus, and casino heiress Miriam Adelson. And for the Dems, there's Nancy Pelosi's longtime associate and American Israel Public Affairs Committee AIPAC agent Amy Rothschild-Friedkin, Goldman Sachs financier and former Massachusetts State Treasurer Stephen Grossman, and billionaire media mogul Chaim Saban. Saban, by the way, is an example of an Israeli American. That is, a person who currently is, or who at some point was, a dual national. Other uncontroversial examples include ex-Federal Reserve Vice Chair Stanley Fischer, who had previously been governor of the Bank of Israel, as well as Illinois politician and Obama White House Chief of Staff Rahm Emanuel. Disputed examples, or people whose dual citizenship is asserted or suspected, but not admitted, include George W. Bush's Secretary of Homeland Security Michael Chertoff, a former law clerk to the Pentagon Papers entangled Judge Murray Gurfein mentioned earlier, and Joe Biden's current Secretary of State Antony John Tony Blinken. A second competing faction is seen mainly among big city liberals, Chicago, D.C., New York City. However, recently, Republican Josh Hawley drew Jewish disapprobation due to alleged veiled anti-Semitism lurking behind his criticism of cosmopolitan elites. In any case, some big city libs are more avant-garde, professing allegiance to Israel while simultaneously doing such once unthinkable things as cozying up to Iran. This group includes Barack Obama himself, despite opposition from the Pritzker Group, which incidentally bankrolled his entrance into the U.S. Senate. It also includes Pentagon Papers co-author Morton Halperin, Iranian-born one-time White House heavy hitter Valerie Jarrett, Biden appointee Daniel B. Dan Shapiro, and others. Right-wing radio host Mark Levin complains bitterly about how the present Biden administration, despite being populated with several important Jewish politicos, is working to undermine Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu, even as it acts as his cheerleader. Levin has compared the situation to the fracture in the ancient temple cadre that resulted in outright terrorism and assassinations by partisans, called the Sicarii, in the streets of Old World Jerusalem. This chaos was so destabilizing that the Roman Empire finally conquered the city and drove out the Jews for almost 2,000 years. In light of all this, just what is in store for the remainder of 2024 and beyond? We're not sure, but we suspect that folk musician Robert Allen Zimmerman, aka Bob Dylan, was on to something when he sang, "The Times, They Are A-Changin'." Yeah, it was released in 1964, not 68. Close enough.